So, I've just recently read Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance, and indeed I've then also read and watched a number of critiques of their book too. And I found it quite ironic that, despite the enjoyable eloquence in the way that the authors write, the responses in the reviews I've seen have been fairly lukewarm and uncertain, suggesting that they didn't quite manage to land their core message with enough clarity. Which is a shame, because I think they're highlighting some really important points. So in this video, I'm going to first outline their core ideas, followed by a quick summary of the main critiques I've read so far. Early in the book, Klein and Thompson note that they're not writing this book to convince the American right of their ideas, in particular because the American right does not share their sense of urgency around climate change. And so the book is meant to be understood as part of the discussion within the progressive side of American politics about what they are getting wrong. For example, the authors use the political failures in liberal progressive California as a poster child for the general problems that they're identifying. Liberals should be able to say, vote for us and we'll govern the country the way we govern California. Instead, conservatives are able to say, vote for them and they will govern the country the way they govern California. California has spent decades trying and failing to build high-speed rail. It has the worst homelessness problem in the country. It has the worst housing affordability problem in the country. It trails only Hawaii and Massachusetts in its cost of living. As a result, it is losing hundreds of thousands of people every year to Texas and Arizona. What has gone wrong? Their answer to this question can be summarized in three nested ideas that they pull together. Ideas that have been developing in various circles, including the Yes in My Backyard, YIMBY housing movement, and what some call the broader abundance movement. And while the book focuses on American politics, these arguments apply just as much to the politics in other countries. The first idea is that Klein and Thompson advocate for a high-level vibe shift away from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. We imagine a future not of less, but of more. We do not subscribe to the seductive ideologies of scarcity. We will not get more or better jobs by closing our gates to immigrants. We will not turn back climate change by persuading the world to starve itself of growth. And I totally agree that a politics of abundance, if possible, will not only be more attractive to voters than a politics of scarcity, but will also give us the psychological room to be more generous with others. A politics of abundance can support a culture of kindness. Instead, we're already seeing today the way that a politics of zero-sum scarcity leads too quickly to a culture of indifference or even cruelty towards the other. But a running theme throughout their book is the observation that many aspects of the progressive agenda logically imply a massive rebuilding of the physical infrastructure of society, building more homes, more wind farms, an upgraded energy grid, new transportation, and so on. And the authors correctly note that the real problem is not finding the money to pay for these projects to rebuild society. California raised the money to build high-speed rail. It has the money to build more houses. And indeed, although the authors don't mention it, I'd also note that the ideas of modern monetary theory also suggest that finding the money to generate the demand for such projects is not the problem. The problem is on the supply side. The problem is that a state like California is repeatedly failing to successfully deliver projects, even when the money is there. So this is the second major idea they argue for, supply-side progressivism. This theme runs right through the book, and at the end, they come back to it by talking about the need for progressives to have a relentless focus on finding the supply-side bottlenecks that hold back building projects or scientific research or the deployment of innovations. To be a bottleneck detective is to recognize that wise policy begins with an investigation rather than an ideology that tries to force the same key into a variety of ill-fitting locks. Making progress in these industries requires first that we want to understand how does this industry actually work. From that question can emerge an agenda for overcoming the barriers to growth. And this leads on to the third key idea of their book, arguably the most controversial of their suggestions, which is that some of the most significant bottlenecks that hinder the delivery of projects come from the multitude of interlocking regulations and grant requirements, many of which originate from the progressive side of politics. And the authors are very clear that most of these regulations or grant requirements make sense individually, like environmental reviews to assess the impact of a large building project, or audit requirements to make sure that a grant is being spent as intended. The problem is that large projects get tied up spending huge amounts of time and money negotiating their way through all of the overlapping spaghetti mess of these bureaucratic hurdles. For example, the Californian high-speed rail project has spent over 10 years and counting, working its way through the environmental review process. And these delays matter because, as the authors say, timetables like that will not meet the climate emergency we now face. Either we build faster or we accept catastrophe. There is no third option. And on top of that, right-wing voices use these failing projects to exemplify their argument that governments just waste money and can't get anything done. They've given rhetorical cover to the absurd chainsaw logic of the extremely libertarian, almost minarchist Doge agenda that is right now trying to radically cut down the scope of the American government. So, if in contrast you believe, as I do, that there are sectors of our political economy where markets can't work effectively, and so governments instead have to act, then it is essential that we find ways to improve the capacity of our governments to deliver projects in a timely and cost-effective way. And yet, the authors explain, at least in America, the laws and then legal precedents set, for example, by the lawsuits brought by Ralph Nader in the 1960s to protect the environment and individuals from corporate and government excesses. These laws have not been updated to recognize the contemporary political context. The problem with the laws we have is that they are indiscriminate. It is as easy to obstruct an oil refinery as a wind farm. And you can bog clean energy projects down in environmental reviews. You can use a process meant to stop the government from building a highway through your town to keep a non-profit developer from building affordable housing down the block. So, to unlock the supply side to enable effective delivery, Klein and Thompson suggest that these regulations need to change, and they give examples of successful projects like the rapid rebuild of a key bridge on the I-95, where building in the USA can be impressively fast when Congress, or in this case the state governor, streamline or exempt the projects from having to comply with various of these regulations. In the case of building affordable housing in cities, the authors highlight the zoning rules as examples of regulations that should be revisited to help encourage higher density housing in the places where people want to live. So, an overly simple view would be that they're trying to make a progressive argument for deregulation. Indeed, we can redescribe all of the three nested ideas I've outlined as being attempts to capture and reimagine territory that has traditionally had a more right-wing valence. Abundance is often associated with the endless consumerist growth of capitalism, especially nowadays in the light of AI-driven automation, whereas progressive environmentalists have traditionally worried about the limits to growth and planetary boundaries. Supply-side economics is usually associated with right-wing tax cuts for the wealthy, and deregulation is usually associated with the right-wing libertarian dream of small government. So it's easy to see how the core message of the book, if misunderstood, has the potential to provoke quite a bit of pushback. But Klein and Thompson do a largely good job of heading off such surface-level critiques, as they make it clear that they are talking about an abundance of socially useful things like clean energy and affordable houses and cheap, effective medicines. And in terms of supply-side economics, they're certainly not talking about tax cuts. They're talking about how to enable the government and the market to have the capacity to deliver the progressive agenda effectively. And in critiquing the debilitating cobweb of regulations, they're certainly not arguing against the important role of government, saying, for example, decades of attacks on the state have turned liberals into reflexive champions of government. But if you believe in government, you must make it work. To make it work, you must be clear-eyed about when it fails and why it fails. And indeed, the critiques I've read so far don't really disagree with the general high-level points that Klein and Thompson are making. But let's take a brief look at the ways that others are being more critical. So, I've linked below the review articles and videos that I'm referring to here, from which, broadly speaking, there are three main criticisms of the book. The most significant frustration that people have had about the book is that it is almost completely silent about the damaging and dominating impact that oligarchical corporate power is having on our political economy. And indeed, I would note that there are also other important dimensions of our current political moment that Klein and Thompson don't tackle in this book. But personally, I think these omissions should just be understood as a failure of the presentation of their book, rather than a failure in their thinking, because they could simply have been clearer that this book is focusing on just one particular dimension of the political moment we're facing. Their book isn't a broad manifesto covering all aspects of our current politics. It's just focusing on the very serious and consequential problem of why governments often fail to deliver, even when the money is available. But arguably, their failure to be clear about this particular focus and to contextualize it is maybe why their book didn't land quite as well as it could have done. The second criticism, as I've touched on before, is that it is easy to read their book as making a progressive argument for a massive program of deregulation. Again, I suspect this is a failure in the clarity of their writing, rather than being an accurate reflection of their thinking. But it is a problem because it potentially leaves their book open to being used as an agreeing voice on the left for those on the right, who do indeed want to simply slash and burn all of these kinds of regulations. Personally, I would like to have seen the authors stick up more obviously and loudly for the principles of what these laws and regulations are trying to do, such as to provide the kind of environmental protection and community engagement that market forces alone would not deliver. The problem with these regulations and rules are not that they temper the raw market forces. That is still necessary. The problem is that there are so many overlapping regulations from different sources that in combination they end up being too complex, too costly, and, most importantly, they just take too long to complete. So these regulatory processes do urgently need radical reform and simplification in order for government and the market to be able to deliver effectively on the progressive agenda. And here I agree completely with Klein and Thompson that the hard truth for the progressive side of politics is that irrespective of whether these regulations are now being weaponized by corporate interests, the existence of many of the regulations are because of progressive goals: biodiversity, community engagement, fair working conditions, a clean environment, and so on. We need to find a better way to progress these goals while also being able to rapidly rebuild the infrastructure of society to meet other progressive agendas, affordable housing, clean, sustainable, abundant energy, and so on. And we need to find a way to do this in a way that can't be so easily gamed and perverted by corporate interests. And squaring this circle is a tough problem, and one that I felt Klein and Thompson didn't really provide a clear enough roadmap for how to potentially solve. To me, this is about finding ways to simplify and coordinate overlapping regulations from different sources, and developing regulatory procedures that can be more easily time-bounded. This should end up where, for example, large building projects still do environmental reviews and still engage with the community, but in a more unified, faster approach that has to be complete, say, within 3 months or something like that. This may even cost more money up front, but I think that'd be worth it in exchange for the certainty of finishing this process in a given time frame, and then a confident green light to progress the build at pace. And while Klein and Thompson would probably agree with the general thrust of what I've just said, their most vivid examples were about removing regulations like zoning rules for housing development, or in the case of the rapid I-95 rebuild, the way the governor waived the need for environmental reviews at all. This feeds into the impression that they might just be arguing for straight-up deregulation. But obviously, if you just removed the rules that are now being used to slow down the building of wind farms near residential areas, you'd have also removed the rules that slow down the building of dirty industries there too. And it's clear that Klein and Thompson are not arguing for that. even if they didn't drive home this important distinction between simple deregulation and radical reform. Finally, the third kind of criticism of the book is where others have questioned their particular policy recommendations. For example, in the review by Glastris and Weisberg, they provide evidence from Minneapolis that lifting the zoning regulations doesn't have the scale of impact on affordable housing that is needed. In contrast, they note that Minneapolis got much better results when they lifted the restriction of how high you can build new residential buildings on previously commercially zoned land near transport corridors. But by my reading, this is exactly the kind of debate that Klein and Thompson would welcome. This is agreement that we need to change something that unlocks the supply side of the situation, even if Klein and Thompson's specific suggestions maybe aren't quite the right thing. And indeed, the authors themselves say, what we are proposing is less a set of policy solutions than a new set of questions around which our politics should revolve. What is scarce that should be abundant? What is difficult to build that should be easy? What inventions do we need that we do not yet have? And I very much agree with the perspective they're putting forward here. In particular, I really like their suggestion that we need to focus more on improving the supply-side capacity of our political economy if we are to deliver the improvements we want for society. Finding the money can be the easier part compared to successful delivery. And of course, there is more in the book than I've been able to explore here, such as applying these ideas to scientific research. So I think Abundance is well worth a read. But have you read the book? What do you think of their arguments? Or what other reviews have you seen? Please do continue the discussion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, then please do subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you for watching.